Water is life. It quenches our thirst, sustains our crops and livestock, enables many industrial processes, and in some places it even powers our factories and homes. Water is symbolically important in any number of cultural traditions, and particular waterways are considered powerful and even sacred by people in many different parts of the world. Fresh water is also increasingly scarce for much of the world's population. According to the UN, 85% of the world population lives in the driest half of the planet. 783 million people do not have access to clean water. Nearly 2.5 billion people do not have access to adequate sanitation, and 6 to 8 million people die annually from the consequences of disasters like floods and water-related diseases. A growing global population needs not just more water, but also more energy and food. Rising demand for food and energy place greater pressure on the supply of fresh water, particularly as growing ranks of consumers opt for air conditioning and meat-heavy diets. Agriculture currently accounts for an estimated 70% of global freshwater use, and this pressure will only increase as demand for beef and other water-intensive foods grows. According to Hoekstra and Chapagin, it takes some 3,500 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice, 15,000 liters to produce 1 kilogram of beef, and 140 liters to produce a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, the demand for fresh water for hydropower and other renewables, including the biofuels we have discussed previously, is expected to increase 60% by 2030. These pressures are further exacerbated by pollution, with industrial pollutants, synthetic fertilizer, and waste from human and livestock populations a growing threat to freshwater sources worldwide. Many regions around the world will experience a decrease in water availability, even as global demand for fresh water increases another 19% by 2050. Faced with these pressures, and with the uncertainty created by anthropogenic climate change, some activists and policymakers have declared a global water crisis. They have called for better cooperation among international actors to ensure rational management of and equitable access to global supplies of fresh water. At the same time, however, many state and private actors are working to secure control over water as a source of stability, power, and in some cases, profit. Water scarcity has already played a role in a number of violent conflicts, such as the civil war in Sudan, and many experts expect such conflicts to multiply in the future as states seek access to water controlled by other states or seek to prevent water within their own boundaries from flowing outward. But even in cases where violent conflict over water is not an immediate risk, debates rage over how water access should be governed. Is access to water a human right that should be guaranteed by law? Or is water best handled as a commodity with its cost regulated by the forces of supply and demand? Either of these approaches entails trade-offs. Privatizing water supplies may create an incentive for their owners to manage and facilitate them, but it also raises difficult questions regarding how to regulate quality and ensure universal access. Attempts to privatize water supplies have been strongly resisted in many parts of the world, such as in Bolivia, which saw the so-called water wars in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Similarly, making water a human right may promise universal access, but it leaves open the question of who will shoulder the burden of providing infrastructure and management. Kenya, for example, guarantees access to water and sanitation in its constitution, but this does not mean that every Kenyan sees these rights fulfilled in practice. As you review the materials for this unit and encounter water-related debates outside of this class, I encourage you to consider the trade-offs of different approaches to water management. Likewise, I encourage you to view claims about water scarcity with a critical eye. Water is indeed a scarce resource, but scarcity is also a social construction that is often used as an excuse for projects of territorial expansion and/or control. In Israel, for example, narratives of water abundance were initially used to attract settlers, but the narrative later shifted to one of scarcity in conjunction with the expansion and centralization of the Israeli state. Accounts of water scarcity often exhibit the characteristics of environmental narratives that we discussed earlier in the semester. To end, I'll leave you with this question. What are some practical policy measures that can be taken to ensure greater access to safe water for people around the world?